What is going on, everyone? My name is Liam DeBoer and I'm here with Blendr News, and this is the Daily Blend, where we give a quick rundown on the prominent stories going on in Canada and around the world, as well as sharing some of our thoughts and perspectives on the matters at hand. Today, we will be going over a recent report by the Fraser Institute, which highlights the current and future economic woes facing Canadians due to the policies of Trudeau's government. Israel's Netanyahu facing backlash over rejecting calls for a two-state solution as the Palestinian death toll hits 25,000, as well as the ever-intensifying tensions in the Middle East with multiple attacks in multiple countries over the weekend. However, if before we get into the thick of it, you wouldn't mind doing us a favor and hitting the thumbs up button on this video and subscribing to our channel, that would be greatly appreciated. Alright, let's get into it. So, first up is a damning indictment of the current Canadian policies, with the Fraser Institute releasing 24 facts for 2024, urging Canadians to understand the economic and social ramifications of Trudeau's government's actions. Some of the facts that stood out to us most are as follows. Per capita income has stagnated since 2016, lagging far behind the United States, which grew over 4 times as much during that period. The Fraser Institute largely attributed this to declining business investment, which is down 20% compared to our neighbors to the south, causing capital flight exceeding $285 billion since 2014. This has led to the average Canadian earning just shy of $18,000 less annually than the average American. Another major issue is the ever-expanding public sector. Government jobs outpaced private sector growth by 8.5% during the COVID recession, while federal spending ballooned 75% since 2014. This works out to a hefty cost of $11,500 per citizen annually. This burden falling on the taxpayer is the highest in Canadian history. Despite Trudeau and his government claiming tax cuts, 86% of middle-class families pay more due to income tax changes and carbon tax. Lower income families have also faced tax hikes, which has led to 74% of Canadians reporting that they feel overtaxed. Considering the Fraser Institute discovered that the average Canadian pays nearly 50% in taxes, we're quite surprised that 26% of Canadians feel that this level of taxation is appropriate. Environmental policies have added fuel to the fire. The quote-unquote green economy represents only 3% of GDP and 1.6% of jobs. Meanwhile, fossil fuel consumption increased by 59% since 1995. Not to mention, eliminating all Canadian oil and gas emissions would only reduce global emissions by a negligible 0.004%. It should also be noted that the federal energy efficiency regulations increased the cost of a new home by an average of $55,000, which only further aggravates the existing housing crisis the federal government is overwhelmingly responsible for. Unfortunately, the burden isn't solely financial, as healthcare faces similar struggles. Despite being among the highest, nearly $350 billion annually, Canada ranks poorly in access and availability. Wait times for surgery have worsened to 27.7 weeks, while the country lags behind its peers in key metrics like doctors and hospital beds per capita. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, Canada will be the worst performing advanced economy in the world from 2020 all the way to 2060. With elections looming, the Fraser Institute warns that unless drastic changes are made, Canada risks becoming a quote-unquote failure on the international stage. Our current economic landscape serves as a powerful call to action for Canadian voters and policymakers. Trudeau has recently and frequently bragged about how well Canada is doing in terms of foreign investments. The numbers, as reported by the Fraser Institute, paint a different picture. Not to mention that record levels of Canadians have been fleeing the country while we're simultaneously burdening our immigration system with historical rates of new citizens, which is a major piece in the crumbling puzzle of our grossly inflated housing market and healthcare system. When it comes to the ever-expanding public sector, during Trudeau's reign, the amount of federal government employees has increased from 257,000 to 357,000, meaning the amount of bureaucrats who are dependent on taking money out of your wallet in order to fund their salaries has increased by roughly 72% in under a decade. When it comes to Canada's obsession with the green energy transition, we keep getting told by Trudeau's regime that this will be a massive opportunity for Canada's economy. Again, the rhetoric that comes out of their mouth is not backed up by hard data. with green energy contributing only 3% to Canada's GDP. It's hard to argue that this is a sector that the country should bet its future on. To put it in perspective, transportation and warehousing, educational services, as well as scientific and technical services all account for a larger portion of Canada's GDP than green energy. And no one in their right mind would say that we should go all in on those industries to the detriment of others. It's important to keep in mind that things like the carbon tax and lack of energy production at home actually make it harder for other, more productive sectors to thrive. According to the Fraser Institute, Canada's net zero plan will impose at least $45 billion in costs and reward us with a 0.004% reduction in global emissions. Seeing as countries like India and China are continuing to build more and more coal plants as well as increasing their output of emissions, Canada's approach is the political equivalent of spending exorbitant amounts of money on a high-end air purifier for a room with a gaping hole in the wall. To wrap up the detrimental issues imposed upon Canadians by our out-of-touch government, I can't overstate the importance of understanding that a good government is one which is so small that you forget it exists. Alright, let's zoom out a little and take a look at what's happening on a more of a global scale. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu firmly rejected US President Joe Biden's suggestion of creative solutions to bridge gaps on Palestinian statehood. In a social media post following their first conversation in nearly a month, Netanyahu asserted that he would not compromise on full Israeli control over Gaza, which he deemed incompatible with the idea of a Palestinian state. The UN Secretary General criticized the rejection of a two-state solution, deeming it unacceptable and warning it would prolong the Israeli-Palestinian conflict indefinitely. While Netanyahu insists on achieving quote-unquote complete victory against Hamas, a member of Israel's war cabinet considers such a triumph unrealistic. In addition, Hamas-controlled health authorities claim 25,000 Palestinian casualties, while the distinction between combatants and civilians remains unclear. Netanyahu contends that military action is the only way to secure the release of hostages, with over 130 still in Gaza. The citizens of Western nations are unlikely to accept their governments continuing to support Israel if a two-state solution is no longer on the table. Progressive politicians could see their constituents become more aggressive in pressuring them to cut ties with Israel. Now, before highlighting what I believe to be Israel's strategy, I want to make clear that doesn't mean I support it. Understanding something does not mean you condone it. So with that in mind, I believe Netanyahu is abiding by a Machiavellian principle, which is as follows. People should either be caressed or crushed. If you do them minor damage, they will get their revenge, but if you cripple them, there is nothing they can do. If you need to injure someone, do it in such a way that you do not have to fear their vengeance. I also believe that with Netanyahu's current approach, he is only falling into the trap that was set by Hamas in the first place. Again, this is just conjecture, but I believe Hamas aimed to bait Israel into an extreme reaction with the attacks on October 7th in order to undermine their support with Western citizens. If this was their strategy, it seems to be working to a staggering degree. Alright, now let's take a look at some of the mayhem that this conflict has created. In the Middle East, tensions are reaching a boiling point, casting a shadow over any hopes for a peaceful resolution. The recent events in the region have only intensified the already complex situation. US Central Command forces struck a Houthi anti-ship missile on Saturday. US forces determined the missile presented a threat to merchant vessels and US Navy ships in the region, and subsequently neutralized the missile, claiming self-defense. 5 IRGC officers, including a Syrian intel chief, were killed in a strike in Damascus, which has been blamed on Israel. A security source says a multi-story building was entirely flattened by, quote, precision-targeted Israeli missiles. US Central Command said, quote, multiple ballistic missiles and rockets were launched at its Al-Assad base in western Iraq. The attack came just hours after Iran vowed revenge and blamed Israel for a deadly attack on a building housing its elite forces in the Syrian capital, Damascus. The Israeli strike targeted a meeting of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps. The coming days will likely see further shifts in developments on the global stage, demanding a vigilant eye from the world community to address the evolving situation in the Middle East. There is a near infinite numbers of variables at play, which would be hard enough to sort out when parties are in a state of communication. However, when the parties are in a state of conflict, sorting out those variables is next to impossible. I just pray that this conflict doesn't escalate to the point of a global hot war, seeing as Einstein so eloquently warned, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." Anyways, this wraps up today's episode of the Daily Blend, so don't forget to subscribe to keep up to date with future episodes, and if you enjoyed this video, you would probably love our newsletter, which goes out 6 days a week. You can sign up at blendrnews.com, that's BLENDR news.com. Thank you for watching, and we'll catch you next time.